What's up, Whappers? No, that is not a mirage. It is just me, clean shaven. I decided to let go of the beard here with the COVID pandemic and the quarantine. I don't know, just wanted to mix it up, I guess. Don't worry, the beard I'm sure will grow back by the time you graduate high school. Let's get down to business today, where we're talking about the British Empire in the age of imperialism. My old world history teacher in 10th grade, Mr. Sutler, had a saying that stuck with me, and I'm now going to share it with you all. We've talked about other sayings this week. If you don't industrialize, you get imperialized. Well, here's another one that I hope sticks. The sun never sets on the British Empire. By the early 1900s, the British Empire was the largest empire ever built in human history. Bigger than the Mongols, bigger than the Persians, larger than the Romans, not even close. 24% of the world's land masses, 24% of the world's total land was under British control. That includes somewhere around 420 million people were under the British Empire's control. And the enormity and the sheer size, the volume of the British Empire is just incredible. 13.7 million square miles under British control. Now, we've talked about what it means to be British. Remember, that includes the United Kingdom, England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales. And we have to just sort of take a deep breath and appreciate the volume of territory controlled by the British, which is why the sun never set on the British Empire, because at any given point around the world, it was daylight, which means that a British flag was flying somewhere in the daylight. Now, what's this all mean in global context? Well, we have to take a moment and understand that the complexity of imperialism, we can't forget that land was being taken, arrogated from indigenous peoples all over the world, and the British certainly played the largest role in that, given the sheer volume of territories the British took. And it's interesting to me that the British takeover of 24% of the world's landmass began sort of with a major defeat, and it's a good lesson in how a major defeat can sometimes propel you to greatness, whether that be on the scale of an empire like the British or even personal success. Because think about how the 1700s played out for the British. The British were slowly becoming an industrial power, but yet, even with their victory in the 7 Years' War, I'm sure you remember that from Miss Webster Schwartz's class, the 7-Year War, where the British took numerous territories from the French all over the world, including key Caribbean and Canadian territories, as well as really establishing its supremacy in the North American world. So by the 7 Years' War, the British were the dominant power in the Americas, but yet they lose the American Revolution in the 1770s and 1780s. So you would think that the British were experiencing a major setback, a tremendous defeat, losing the American colonies, but yet because they won the 7 Years' War before the American Revolution, the British were in great shape. And by winning the 7 Years' War, the British not only took key territories from the French in the Americas, but they also took key territories from the French in the Caribbean, as well as in certain parts of South Asia, mostly India. So keep in mind that by the 1700s close, the British were not the most powerful empire in the world. I would give that rank to the French with Napoleon. Out of the ashes of Napoleon's defeat comes the rise of the mighty British Empire. And what was key to Britain's rise to power is that not only did they win the 7 Years' War, and they already had a strong foothold in the Americas despite losing the future United States. The British were well positioned because of their crown jewel in South Asia, which is India. Now keep in mind, India back then included not only India today, but Pakistan and Bangladesh, and even other parts of South Asia, including some territories in Afghanistan and as well as Sri Lanka. So the British had already, in the 1700s, dominated trade in the Indian Ocean thanks to the British East India Company's seizure of territories in India. We went over this a while back when we talked about the gunpowder empires, because the Mughals were a gunpowder empire that ruled over India, a Muslim empire that ruled over India for hundreds of years. But enter in the British East India Company with its own private armies and its own private mercenaries, and the British East India Company had taken over parts of India. What's that mean in the long run? Well, the British East India Company, remember, was a joint stock company. It was not a government. How did the British government end up taking over India? Well, In 1857, there was a major uprising against the British East India Company. And in this major uprising, which was called the Sepoy Mutiny, Sepoy, the Sepoy Mutiny was a rebellion against the British East India Company. The British East India Company had been hiring Indians, both Hindu and Muslim, to fight for the British East India Company. The historical legend has it that the Sepoys, which was the name of the soldiers that the British were hiring, the Sepoys rebelled against the British because the Sepoys found out that the British East India Company was using pork and cow fat to grease the bullets. And because pork is a banned food according to most Muslims, and for Hindus, beef is banned, there was a sort of religious uprising against the British East India Company. Now, whether that's the actual cause, that's the story that's been passed down historically. But regardless, the Sepoys were a present threat for the British East India Company. Enter in the British government. The British government steps in, takes over control of India, takes it away from the British East India Company. And by the late 1800s, India is unquestionably the crown jewel of the British Empire in Asia. India, under the British control, was known as the British Raj, R-A-J, the Raj. And it is no doubt the biggest, most powerful part of the British Empire. What made India so valuable? Cotton, lots of cotton. That's where the British got their main cotton from. Also spices, the spice trade, that's the continuity that never stops in the Indian Ocean. But also, it gave the British a powerful labor source with the coolie system, where they were taking South Asians and using them around their empire because slavery had been abolished. So many South Asians were used and imported into various parts of the British Empire. Moving forward into Africa, and when we talk about British Empire building in Africa, we have to look at two important territories that were most significant. The first is Egypt. Egypt held an incredible importance to the British Empire because Egypt was the gateway into the Indian Ocean trade routes from many landlocked territories in Africa. Prior to British imperialism in Africa, there was no way to connect North Africa to the Indian Ocean unless you sailed all the way around Africa. And that means that European countries along the Mediterranean had to go out into the Atlantic, down below Africa, out into the Indian Ocean. Well, the British, with their technological superiority, which developed during the Industrial Revolution, the British engineered one of the great feats in human history by building a canal that cut through the Red Sea, which thus allowed ships to pass from the Mediterranean through the Red Sea out into the Indian Ocean. And the name of this canal was the Suez Canal. Write this down, chalk this up as one of the greatest, most important transportation, technology, engineering feats in human history. In building the Suez Canal, British engineers put together a waterway, a human-made waterway that allowed for the British to ship goods from the Mediterranean directly into the Indian Ocean. And this allowed the British colonies in India, the Raj, to connect directly to Europe. Without Suez Canal, the British would have had none of that possible. So we're talking it just a huge accomplishment by the British in terms of their abilities to dominate Africa. And along with Africa, you've got to talk about one name in particular. He was one of the great imperializers of the 1800s, a man who is synonymous with British power in Africa, and his name is Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes was a powerful business, we're talking billionaire in the time period, and he invested a lot of money in the imperialism game within Africa. I mentioned on previous ATWs the scramble for Africa, how the British and other European countries were going into Africa, taking territory away. Well, Cecil Rhodes, he was one of these powerful businessmen that envisioned Africa to be under complete British control. And although that never happened, Cecil Rhodes was instrumental in financing many ventures, business ventures that led to the construction of railroads. And that's one thing I want you to always remember about Cecil Rhodes. Rhodes Railroads, because Cecil Rhodes' vision was to build a railroad that connected Egypt, North Africa, right, where the Suez Canal was built, and Egypt's capital, which is the largest city in Africa, Cairo. He wanted to build a railroad that went from Cairo, Egypt, all the way to Cape Town, South Africa. What stood in the way of Cecil Rhodes' wild dream of building a railroad all the way across Africa? Well, Cecil Rhodes had to deal with, and the British Empire had to deal with, other European countries in their way. And mainly that was the Dutch. Dutch settlers had first colonized South Africa in the 1700s. But the British, in order to imperialize and build this massive railroad project and also gain more raw materials from Africa, the British had to muscle the Dutch out of Africa. And in muscling the Dutch out of Africa, the British had to fight a war in the 1800s to remove Dutch settlers. The war is known as the Boer War, B-O-E-R, and it gets its name because Dutch settlers were called the Boers. And in the Boer War, the British demonstrated a ruthless brutality in not only killing local native tribes, but also in being willing to kill local Europeans who lived within South Africa. In the Boer Wars, you have one of the first example of concentration camps, meaning the British would take Dutch settlers and concentrate them into prison camps. And that's where the term concentration camps comes from. Certainly, this is not going to be the only instance in world history where armies use concentration camps to separate populations. You'll see this in the Spanish-American War. The Spanish did this with Cuban rebels in Cuba. The United States used concentration camps against the Filipinos, and we'll talk more about the United States and the Philippines next week. And, of course, you get into more modern wars. In World War II, the Germans used concentration camps in their Nazi empire. But the British were using concentration camps to help defeat the South African Dutch, which they did. The British won the Boer Wars, and this paved the way for the British to come into South Africa, not only to build the railroad, which they attempted but never completed, by the way, but nonetheless, the British also began to dominate the all-important diamond trade, which South Africa became a very important diamond. Raw materials of diamonds became very important in the global trade, and the British became the sole benefactor of winning the Boer Wars because they established a very robust diamond trade in South Africa. Speaking of railroads, though, railroads were unquestionably the hallmark, the staple of European imperialism, especially British imperialism. Throughout India, throughout Africa, throughout the Caribbean, the British, wherever they went, wherever that sun was not setting, the British were building railroads because railroads were the ultimate sign of European technology, European engineering, and of course, European power. Railroads were a symbol of dominance, and if you could build railroads, you could imperialize and connect various parts of your empires over land. And railroads were, by the 1800s, the most important transportation mode on the planet. And so, seeing how railroads were important, the Cape Town to Cairo Railroad, the vision of Cecil Rhodes, ultimate sign of British domination in Africa, and the British were carving themselves a major portion of Africa, especially with Egypt and South Africa. But you also have to include other territories, and you're seeing maps throughout this that show where the British took over. Places like Kenya, for example, was one of Britain's great colonies in Africa. So moving from Africa, though, I'm going to talk about two more regions. I want to talk about Australia briefly. Australia was brought into the British Empire in the late 1700s. Interestingly, it was not conquered as African territories or parts of India were. Australia was initially settled by prisoners. The British would ship their prisoners to Australia, and they would dump the prisoners as sort of like, here you go, you're in the middle of nowhere, good luck. The British would ship prisoners to Australia. What ended up happening over time is the prisoners began to overwhelm the local native Aborigine population, and the indigenous Aborigines, which is the name specific to Australia, began to suffer calamities of disease and death, just like so many parts of the world when Europeans first arrived and spread diseases. Now, the Aborigine population began to be severely reduced, and they moved inland away from the coast where the British kept sending thousands upon thousands of prisoners. But over time, Australia became known in what is termed a squatter colony. And this is different than a lot of the empire building, so it's a very important comparison difference, because in many of the British Empire places, the British conquered and arrogated and dominated land with the military. But in Australia, rather, the British took land and by just simply squatting and living on the land. And so eventually, not only was it prisoners, but regular British citizens came to Britain and they just simply plopped down on the land and took the land. This also happened in New Zealand, next door neighbor to Australia. Many British squatters or settlers came to establish farms and land. And in New Zealand, there was even a indigenous conflict with the Maori, who were a type of Polynesian peoples. We've talked about them before. And many Maori began to die in New Zealand as a result of European diseases and conflicts with white squatters or settlers. So Australia and New Zealand are important pieces of the British Empire, and they were taken not through force so much, but through squatting and settling and farming. But with diseases came the demise of Aborigines in Australia and unfortunately Maori in New Zealand. Deep breath, we're almost done here. We got to talk China, because what happened with the British Empire in China will pave the way and set in motion what we're going to talk about in greater detail in class on Friday. When you talk about the demise of China during the age of imperialism, it comes down to one more important maxim I've shared all week, which is if you don't industrialize, you get imperialized. China was undergoing a tremendous change over time. China was no longer the most powerful place on earth. That had shifted now towards Europe. And in doing so, one of the main reasons China lost power had to do with its lack of industrialization. Now, on Friday, I'm going to talk greater detail about China. But this is the last Chinese dynasty ever. The Ming collapsed by the 1600s and entered the Qing, Qing. So the Qing Empire rules China from about the 1600s to early 1900s, which means in the age of imperialism, it's the Qing Empire that's going to come into direct conflict with other European and American powers. And the beginning of China's conflicts with Europe starts with the British, because the British have been creeping over into East Asia slowly but surely. And one of the main reasons that the British gained such a foothold in China, no longer was the demand for European silver as high as it once was in China. We talked about the silver trade with the Spanish silver coming into China and really wreaking havoc on the Chinese economy during the Ming dynasty. But it's no longer silver that's the main demanded resource in China from Europe. Rather, it was opium, an addictive, sedative drug. Opium, which came from out of England and other European powers, empires in South Asia. Opium was harvested there in South Asia and also as well as Central Asia and even in parts of Africa. So the British, due to their global reach, had great access to this sedative and addictive drug. And the British began trading opium into China at incredibly high numbers. And it wasn't just the British, by the way. Many other countries were also exchanging illicit drugs into China. But what ends up happening by the mid-1800s is the Qing dynasty has a major crisis on its hands. Opium is infiltrating the country, the military, the population is being addicted, and so you have millions of Chinese that were being under the influence of opium. It's very similar in modern times to cocaine, the spread of cocaine as an addictive drug. When the cocaine epidemic occurred here in the United States in the 1970s and 80s, drug epidemics happen. And the opium epidemic struck China with a tremendous impact. And so as a result of the Europeans and British trying to trade drugs in China, the Chinese government is under immense pressure to keep Europeans out. And the more pressure the Chinese Qing government faces, the more the Europeans try to crack down. And so there will be two separate wars fought in the 1830s and 1840s between the British and the Chinese government, in which the British end up securing control of key trade ports, including Hong Kong, from the Chinese. And so the British take over key trade ports in Hong Kong, and also they secure trade rights to continue to trade opium into China, mainly because the Chinese just simply couldn't fend off the industrial military power of the British. And so it's a hard lesson for the Chinese to learn. We'll talk more specifics in the future about China and how it was facing not only pressure from the British, but other European countries began to sense the Qing government could not take care of itself, and perhaps the Qing were losing the mandate of heaven. So more on China. But for this longer edition of the ATW, I just want you to take a deep breath. You've got the review questions to follow along with as you're going. I'm picking the most important topics out of these to review. But I hope you guys have enjoyed this British Empire talk. As always, you know the past shapes the future. Have a great rest of your week, Whappers. See you on Friday in class.